The rain that fell on Nashville that Tuesday night in October wasn't the romantic kind that songwriters like to describe. The kind that washes away sins and brings new beginnings. It was the cold, stubborn, relentless rain of the South when autumn decides it's done being gentle. The kind that soaks through a denim jacket in 30 seconds flat and turns the gravel parking lots of Lower Broadway into shallow rivers of muddy water and cigarette butts. Danny Calloway sat in his 2003 Ford F-150, engine idling, heater broken, watching the neon lights of the rusty spur bleed color into the wet pavement. The bar's sign flickered. The S in spur had been half dead for 3 months, giving the place a name that felt somehow appropriate for everything in his life right now. The Rue Thai Spur. Incomplete. Broken in the middle. He was 40 minutes early for his set. He always came early. It was one of the last habits he'd kept from the version of himself he used to respect. The version that believed punctuality meant something, that showing up prepared was a form of dignity even when dignity was the only thing you had left. Danny reached over to the passenger seat and picked up the Gibson J45 in its cracked hardshell case. The case had a sticker on it from the Bluebird Cafe, the real one on Hillsborough Pike, from a showcase he'd played 7 years ago. Back when people in this town still said his name with something resembling anticipation. He was 34 years old and felt 58. The bar was half full when he pushed through the door, the warmth hitting him like a physical thing after the cold outside. It smelled like every bar in Nashville smelled. Beer and fried food and ambition slowly fermenting into something less identifiable. The stage at the Rusty Spur was barely a platform. 6 inches off the ground, 8 feet wide, with a single spotlight that always pointed slightly to the left, meaning performers spent their entire set leaning into the light like plants reaching for a window. Danny, the bartender, a thick-armed woman named Patrice Bloom, nodded at him without looking up from the glass she was polishing. "You're early." "Always am." "Want something before you go on?" "Water's fine." She finally looked up, and something in her expression shifted. Not pity exactly. More like the careful neutrality of someone who had watched enough people fall apart in this room to know better than to comment on the ones in progress. Danny set up his equipment, which consisted of plugging a single cable from his guitar into the house system and adjusting a microphone stand, and sat on the wooden stool that had been there since before he first played this stage 4 years ago. The foam on the seat was compressed into the shape of every musician who'd sat there hoping tonight would be different. He played his first set to an audience of 11 people, 3 of whom were watching football on the bar's television, and 2 of whom were having an argument in the corner that had nothing to do with music. He played Troubadour and The Chair. Covers, always covers in places like this, because originals required people to actually listen. And he played them well. Danny Calloway had always played well. That had never been the problem. The problem was everything else. 3 weeks earlier, Danny had stood on the stage of a proper Nashville venue, the Station Inn on Opryland Drive, during an open mic night that had drawn a legitimate crowd. Word had gotten out, the way word sometimes still got out about him, carried by the few people in this city who remembered what he used to be. He'd played an original, Red Dirt Road Home, a song he'd written in the parking lot of a Waffle House in Murfreesboro at 2 in the morning. The kind of song that comes out of a person all at once, like something that had been waiting behind a door. For 3 minutes and 40 seconds, the room had been completely silent. Not the bad kind of silence, the rare kind. Then it ended, and the applause was real. The kind that starts slow because people aren't sure what they just felt and need a second to process it before their hands start moving. Danny had felt, for the first time in a long time, like himself. Then Robert Finley had come backstage. Robert Finley was 31, wore expensive boots that had never seen actual dirt, and worked as a talent scout for a mid-level management company called Pinnacle South. He had the handshake of a man who'd practiced it, and the smile of someone who'd learned it from a book. "That song," Robert said, tapping his chest twice. "Hit me right here, man. Seriously. That's the real stuff." Danny knew he should have been more careful. He'd been around Nashville long enough to know that every sentence that started with genuine flattery ended with something that would cost him. But the applause was still fresh in his chest, and he was tired. So profoundly, bone-deeply tired of being careful. And so he listened. Robert's offer had seemed straightforward. A 6-month development deal, modest advance, studio time at a facility in East Nashville, and representation to get Danny in front of the right people. The contract was 15 pages long, and Danny had read 12 of them before his eyes started sliding off the words, and he told himself the parts he hadn't read were probably standard. He signed. 2 weeks later, he discovered that the studio time was 3 sessions total. The advance was actually a loan structured against future earnings at an interest rate that belonged in a different industry entirely. And the exclusivity clause meant he couldn't perform original material publicly for 6 months without Pinnacle South's written approval. When he called Robert to discuss it, the call went to voicemail. It always went to voicemail after that. The second set at the Rusty Spur was to 9 people. One of them fell asleep. Danny was packing up his guitar when a man at the end of the bar, mid-50s, weathered face, baseball cap pulled low, caught his eye and raised his beer bottle in a small salute. Not the ironic kind. The genuine kind, from someone who'd actually been paying attention. Danny nodded back. Outside, the rain had slowed to a mist. He sat in his truck for a long time without starting the engine, the guitar case on the seat beside him, the city glowing orange and cold through the fogged windshield. His phone showed 2 missed calls from his brother Brett, and a text from Carol that read, "Lily asked about you again. I didn't know what to tell her." Lily was his daughter. She was 6 years old, and the last time Danny had held her properly, not the stiff, careful hug of a supervised visit, but actually held her the way he used to when she was small enough to fall asleep against his shoulder, had been 8 months ago. He put the phone face down on the dash. There was a specific quality to despair that Danny had come to recognize. Not the dramatic, cinematic kind that announced itself loudly, but the quiet, administrative kind. The kind that showed up in small, practical realizations. That the heater in the truck had been broken for 2 months, and he kept meaning to fix it, and never did. That the refrigerator in his trailer held a 6-pack of beer, half a block of cheese, and nothing else. That he hadn't called his mother in 3 weeks. That he was good, genuinely good, at the one thing he'd built his entire life around, and it was making absolutely no difference whatsoever. He started the truck and drove south on I-65 toward the trailer park off Nolensville Pike, where he'd been living since the apartment became unaffordable. The apartment having become unaffordable after the studio contract drained his savings and his delivery job, driving for a logistics company called Freight Forward, didn't cover the gap. He told himself, for the first time with something approaching real conviction, that maybe it was time to stop. Not stop living. Just stop this particular version of living that was wearing him down to something he didn't recognize anymore. Maybe Brett was right. Maybe Nashville was a machine that ate certain kinds of people and called it natural selection. Maybe the sensible thing, the adult thing, was to go back to Cookeville, take the job at Brett's hardware supply company, find a 2-bedroom apartment near a decent school district for the weekends with Lily, and play guitar on Sunday afternoons for himself alone. The way a person keeps a photograph of somewhere they used to love without needing to go back. He was almost convinced. Almost. The morning after, Danny had a delivery route that took him through the Brentwood area, a stretch of suburban Nashville where the houses sat back from the road behind old oak trees, and the driveways were long enough to require their own addresses. He delivered auto parts, medical supplies, restaurant equipment, the invisible infrastructure of ordinary life. He was good at the job. Efficient, reliable, never missed a delivery window. He was pulling out of a business complex on Franklin Road when his stomach reminded him he hadn't eaten since the previous afternoon, and he turned into the parking lot of a diner called Maze Road Kitchen, a squat brick building with a hand-painted sign and 4 trucks in the lot, the universal indicator of food worth eating. It was 11:14 in the morning. The diner had 7 booths along the window side, a counter with rotating stools, and walls covered in the collected memorabilia of 30 years of country music fandom. Framed concert posters, signed photographs, album covers behind glass. A ceiling fan turned slowly overhead, despite it being October, because the kitchen heat made it necessary. Danny took a booth near the back, ordered coffee and the biscuits and gravy without looking at the menu, and stared out the window at the parking lot. He was thinking about Lily. Specifically, he was thinking about her last birthday, her 6th, which he had attended for exactly 1 hour and 40 minutes before Carol's expression made it clear that the celebration would be less complicated without him there. He'd watched Lily blow out her candles from the edge of the kitchen, already reaching for his keys, and she'd looked up from the cake and found him with her eyes the way children do, with that pure, uncomplicated accuracy, and waved at him with one small hand, and he had waved back and left. He'd sat in the parking lot of the party venue for 20 minutes before he could drive. "You mind if I sit here? Every other spot's got a talker in it today." Danny looked up. The man who'd asked was somewhere in his early 60s, lean and straight-backed, wearing dark jeans, a pearl snap shirt, and a gray jacket. He had a face that suggested a life spent largely outdoors, not weathered in a hard way, but settled, the way stone settles after years of weather into something that looks like it was always meant to be that shape. He was holding a coffee mug and had the unhurried quality of someone with nowhere urgent to be, who was still, somehow, completely present. Danny gestured at the seat across from him. "Appreciate it," the man said, sitting down. They were quiet for a moment. The comfortable kind that happens between strangers in diners, where there's no social obligation to perform. "Rough morning?" the man asked, nodding at Danny's expression rather than anything specific. Danny almost gave the standard answer. "Fine, just tired. Long week." Instead, for reasons he still couldn't fully explain afterward, he said, "Rough year, honestly." The man nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they mean it. "Those happen." "Yeah." Danny wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. "Yeah, they do." "You from Nashville originally?" "Cookville. Came here about 9 years ago." He paused. "For the music." Something shifted slightly in the man's expression. Not surprise, more like recognition. "You play?" "Guitar. Write songs." Danny said it the way you say a fact about yourself that you're not sure still applies. "Or I used to." "Both." "I don't know anymore." The man was quiet for a beat. Then, "What kind of songs?" "Country. Real country, not the radio stuff." He heard the edge in his voice and softened it. "Not that I'm knocking anyone. It's just not what comes out when I sit down to write." "What comes out?" Danny looked at him. It was an unusually direct question for a diner conversation with a stranger. "Stories," Danny said finally. "About people who are trying to hold on to something while everything keeps pulling it away from them." He half laughed, hearing himself. "Which is about as country as it gets, I guess." The man smiled. It was a quiet smile, not performed, not packaged. "Yeah," he said, "that's about as country as it gets." They talked for the better part of an hour. Danny didn't ask the man's name, which he would later find strange, but there was something about the conversation that didn't require it, that existed in its own space outside the normal coordinates of a professional city, where everyone was always networking, always calculating. The man asked questions that required real answers and listened to those answers the way musicians listen to music, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually hearing what was being said. He asked about the contract situation with Pinnacle South, and Danny explained it, and the man listened without the reflexive optimism that most people offered. The "it'll work out, and these things happen for a reason" that Danny had come to understand as ways of ending conversations rather than having them. "You know what I'd do?" the man said when Danny finished. "I'd call an entertainment lawyer, specifically one who handles artist rights. There are 3 or 4 in Nashville who are worth their fees. The exclusivity clause you're describing may have grounds for challenge, depending on how the consideration was structured." He paused. "The music business eats people who don't have someone in their corner who understands contracts. Not because the people in it are all bad. Some of them are, but mostly it's just because the structure favors the people who've been doing this longer. I can't afford a lawyer right now. Some of them work on contingency for cases with clear merit." The man pulled a pen from his jacket pocket, an actual pen, the ballpoint kind, and wrote a name and number on a paper napkin. "This woman is the best I know at this particular kind of situation. Tell her George sent you." Danny took the napkin. "George?" The man stood, left a 20 on the table for a coffee that had cost $3, and picked up his jacket. "Good luck with the songs," he said. He said it the way people say things they mean. The real ones are worth fighting for. He walked out of the diner. Danny looked at the napkin. The name written on it was Ellen Marsh, Marsh & Cole Entertainment Law. Below it, a Nashville phone number. He sat there for a long time after, the noise of the diner steady around him, thinking about the quality of that conversation, the strange, specific relief of being listened to by someone who had no reason to and expected nothing in return. He didn't find out, until 3 days later, who George was. It was Brett who told him, after Danny mentioned the encounter, described the man, the diner, the conversation. Brett had gone very still on the other end of the phone. "Danny?" Brett said slowly. "That was George Strait." Danny said nothing. The George Strait, king of country, 80-some #1 hits. A pause. "You talked to George Strait for an hour in a diner in Brentwood, and you didn't even recognize him?" Danny looked at the napkin on the trailer's small kitchen table. "He didn't act like I should have." Brett made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and disbelief. "What does that even mean?" "It means he just talked to me," Danny said. "Like a person." Ellen Marsh had an office on Music Row that was deliberately understated. No gold records on the wall, no framed magazine covers, none of the architectural flex that characterized most successful entertainment law practices in Nashville. What she had was a bookshelf that covered an entire wall, a desk organized with military precision, and the kind of direct eye contact that made it immediately clear she had no interest in wasting time, yours or hers. She was 51, had practiced entertainment law for 23 years, and had the particular quality of someone who had heard every version of every music industry story and could place yours within the first 3 minutes of the conversation. Danny sat across from her on a Thursday morning, the napkin on the desk between them, which he'd brought as what felt like the only appropriate credential, and told her everything. The open mic, Robert Finley, the contract, the unanswered calls. She let him speak without interrupting, making occasional notes on a yellow legal pad with a mechanical pencil. And when he finished, she picked up the copy of the contract he'd brought and read it in a silence that lasted 11 minutes. "George sent you," she said, not looking up from the contract. "Yes, ma'am." She turned a page. "How long ago did you sign this?" 5 weeks. She made a mark on her legal pad. The consideration for the exclusivity clause is insufficient on its face. 3 recording sessions is not adequate exchange for 6 months of performance restriction on original material. She set the contract down. "There are 2 other structural problems I'd want to look at more carefully. But based on what I'm reading, you have grounds to challenge the enforceability of at least the exclusivity provision." She paused. "I work contingency on cases with clear merit. This qualifies." Danny had prepared himself for a range of responses. This was not among them. "So you'll take it?" "I said it qualifies." She picked up her pencil again. "Tell me about the songs, not the contract, the music. What are you actually working on?" It was an unexpected question from a lawyer, and it caught him off balance in a way that the legal discussion hadn't. He told her about Red Dirt Road Home, about 3 other songs he'd written in the past year, The Weight of Wanting, County Line, and a ballad called Forgiven Once that he'd never played for anyone because it was too close to the bone, written about Carol and Lily and the specific shape of a marriage that comes apart slowly, not all at once, but in small daily failures that accumulate until one day the person across the table looks at you, and neither of you can remember the last time things felt easy. Ellen Marsh listened to the titles and the descriptions with the same attention she'd given the contract. "Get those recorded," she said. "Properly. Not a phone demo, a real session." She wrote something on a card and slid it across the desk. "This studio gives competitive rates on off-peak hours. Tuesday and Wednesday mornings, 6 to 10 a.m. The room is usually available. Tell them I referred you." Danny picked up the card. "Why are you doing this?" She looked at him. "Because George Strait has called me exactly 4 times in 20 years with referrals, and every single time it was worth it." A pause, and then something almost like a smile. "And because that exclusivity clause is genuinely offensive to my professional sensibilities." The studio was called Meridian Sound, and it sat in a converted Victorian house in East Nashville, the kind of neighborhood that had been through 3 identities in 20 years, and was currently in the version that involved coffee shops and recording studios coexisting with old-timers who remembered when the street was something different entirely. The engineer was a man named Cal Waverly, mid-40s, beard going gray at the edges, the calm, specific competence of someone who'd spent a quarter-century in rooms where other people's vulnerabilities were recorded at high fidelity. He'd worked with names Danny recognized and names nobody outside this industry would ever know. And he treated both with the same matter-of-fact professionalism. The first Tuesday morning session, Danny arrived at 5:47 a.m. and sat in his truck until 6, going over chord arrangements in his head. The air was cold, and the street was empty, and the Victorian house glowed from the inside with warm light. And for a moment, in the specific stillness of that pre-dawn hour, something shifted in Danny's chest. Not dramatically, nothing like a movie moment, but quietly. The way a season changes, imperceptibly at first, then all at once. He had 4 songs. He had 3 months before the legal challenge was expected to produce a result. He had a delivery route that started at 8 and ended at 5, and paid him $1,940 every 2 weeks, which was not enough, but was something. He went inside. Cal Waverly had coffee made. They spent the first hour doing nothing but talking. Cal asking about the songs, about the sound Danny was after, about influences and instruments, and what, specifically, he wanted a person to feel when the last note of Red Dirt Road Home faded out. I want them to feel like they just called someone they should have called a long time ago, Danny said. Cal wrote that down. 3 weeks into the recording sessions, Danny was running his delivery route on a gray Wednesday when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He pulled over to answer it. He always pulled over, a habit from before the accident that wasn't his fault, but had taken 3 points off his license anyway. And the voice on the other end was familiar before he could place it. This Danny Calloway? Speaking. Alan Jackson. Got your number from Ellen Marsh, who told me to call you, which tells me something about your situation. Danny stared at the dashboard. You still there? Yes, sir, Danny managed. I'm here. Alan Jackson's voice had the easy, unhurried cadence of a man from Newnan, Georgia, who had never quite let go of the way people talked there, even after decades of Nashville and stadiums and everything that came with it. He was 66 years old and had sold more records than most people could count, and had the reputation, among the people who'd worked with him over the years, of being the rarest thing in the music business. Genuinely who he appeared to be. Ellen says you've got some songs worth hearing, Alan said. I'm not making any promises about anything. I want to be straight with you on that. But I'm going to be in East Nashville on Saturday afternoon, and I'd like to hear what you're working on if you're willing. Danny said yes before he'd finished processing the question. After the call ended, he sat in the truck for a long time on the shoulder of Old Hickory Boulevard, a box of restaurant supply equipment in the cargo area, the engine running, a slow October afternoon light moving through the trees along the road. He called Brett. The Alan Jackson just called me, he said when his brother answered. Brett was silent for a moment. Then, Danny, what is happening to your life right now? I genuinely don't know. Is this the same George Strait situation? Is this a thing that just happens to you? It appears to be. Brett laughed. A real laugh. The kind Danny hadn't heard from his brother in a long time. The kind that came from genuine surprise rather than performed enthusiasm, which was the only kind of laugh that had ever meant anything between them. The meeting with Alan Jackson happened in the production room at Meridian Sound on a Saturday afternoon, when the rest of the studio was quiet. Cal Waverly was there. Alan had asked if he could bring his own ears, which was how he put it. And Danny set up with just his Gibson and the stool and played all 4 songs in sequence without stopping. Alan Jackson sat in a folding chair with his elbows on his knees and his eyes somewhere that wasn't the room, which is where musicians go when they're really listening. When Danny finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Play Forgiven once again, Alan said. Danny played it again. Alan was quiet for a longer moment after this one. That song is about your daughter, he said. It wasn't a question. Partly. The line in the second verse, I watched her learn to walk without me holding on, and told myself that counted as being strong. Alan stopped. That's a real line. That's not a constructed line. Somebody lived that. Yes, sir. Alan looked at Cal. Something passed between them that Danny couldn't fully read, but that felt significant. I want to bring this to someone, Alan said. I'm not telling you who yet, because I don't want to get your expectations set somewhere they might not land. But there's a project I'm involved in, peripherally, that I think these songs fit into in a way that matters. He paused. The legal situation with Pinnacle South. Ellen's handling it? She is. Good. She'll handle it. He stood up, and he was taller than Danny expected. Or maybe it was the quality of his presence in the room. You've got the real stuff, Danny. I'm not the first person to tell you that, and I won't be the last. The question's always been whether the real stuff is enough, and the honest answer is that it should be, but it isn't always. The music business is not a meritocracy, and anybody who tells you different is selling something. A pause. But every now and then, it gets close enough. He shook Danny's hand. The real kind. 2 hands. the kind that means something, and left. Danny sat on the stool for a while after, in the quiet of the production room, the guitar across his lap, the afternoon light coming through the high window at the angle that meant it was almost 4 o'clock. Cal Waverly leaned against the mixing board and looked at him. "You okay?" "I don't know what's happening," Danny said honestly. Cal nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "That's usually what it looks like when something good starts." The hardest part wasn't the music. It was Carol Hendricks. Carol was 32, taught 3rd grade at an elementary school in Bellevue, and had the specific exhausted clarity of someone who had loved a person through several versions of themselves and finally decided she was entitled to stop. She was not mean about it. She had never been mean, which was in some ways harder to accept than if she had been. She was simply done, in the way that people become done after too many disappointments that don't announce themselves dramatically, but simply accumulate until one morning you wake up and realize that the weight you've been carrying has a name. And the name is this relationship, and the only way to put it down is to leave. She'd left 20 months ago. She had been right to. Danny knew this. He'd known it at the time, which somehow made it worse, rather than better. Their arrangement was standard. Lily stayed with Carol during the week. Danny had every other weekend and Wednesday evenings. The Wednesday evenings were the ones Danny organized his entire week around. He adjusted his delivery route. He turned down the few bar gigs that fell on Wednesday nights. He kept the trailer clean and stocked with Lily's specific preferences. Apple juice, the crackers that came in individual packs, a coloring book series about animals she'd been working through since August. Carol communicated with him primarily by text, and primarily about logistics. She was not unkind in these texts. She was not warm either. She existed in the careful middle register of a person who had decided that emotional neutrality was the only sustainable way to co-parent with someone she no longer trusted. In October, Danny had asked if he could have an additional Saturday with Lily. Brett was visiting from Cookville and wanted to see his niece, and the original schedule didn't accommodate it. Carol's response had taken 6 hours and consisted of 2 sentences. "I'll think about it. But I need you to understand that trying isn't the same as reliable. And Lily needs reliable." He hadn't pushed it. But Brett came anyway. And they sat in the trailer on a Saturday afternoon with the football game on and takeout from a barbecue place on Nolansville Pike. And at some point, the game became background noise, and they talked the way they hadn't talked in years. The real way. Without performance, without the careful management of each other's expectations that had characterized their relationship since Danny moved to Nashville, and Brett stayed in Cookville, and they'd slowly become, without intending to, representatives of 2 different choices rather than just brothers. "You look better," Brett said, which was a significant statement from Brett, who did not give compliments the way other people did, as social currency, but only as observations he'd verified. "I'm sleeping," Danny said. "First time in a while." "Because of the music," Danny thought about it. "Because of having something to work toward that isn't just surviving." He turned his beer bottle on the table. "There's a difference." Brett was quiet. He was 41, built like a man who'd worked with his hands for 20 years, even though he ran a company now, with their father's jaw and their mother's eyes and a way of looking at you when he was about to say something important that Danny had been reading since childhood. "You know what Mom asked me last week?" Brett said. "Tell me." "She asked if you were okay." He paused. "Not if you were doing well. If you were okay." There's a difference in what she meant. Danny looked at the table. "She misses you calling," Brett said. Not an accusation, just information. Danny nodded. He pulled out his phone and sent his mother a text. Nothing elaborate, just thinking of you. "I'll call Sunday. Love you." And set the phone down. Small things, Brett said, watching him. That's all it ever is. I know. You just keep forgetting. I know that too. On a Monday morning in the third week of November, Danny was loading his truck at the freight forward depot when his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number that he almost didn't open because he'd been getting a lot of unknown numbers lately, and most of them were wrong numbers or robocalls. He opened it. This is Vincent Harlow. I'm a producer with Meridian Records, Nashville. I heard your session recordings through a mutual contact. I'd like to meet. Danny stared at the message. He knew the name. Vincent Harlow had produced 4 albums in the last 3 years, 2 of which had charted, and had a reputation in Nashville's inner circles as someone who could hear commercial potential in things that didn't sound obviously commercial, which was either a gift or a particularly sophisticated form of predation, depending on which musician you asked. He texted Ellen Marsh. Her response came in 4 minutes. I know Harlow. He's not Robert Finley. But don't meet him without me present. Set it for my office. The meeting with Vincent Harlow happened on a Thursday afternoon in Ellen Marsh's office on Music Row, which was, Danny thought, exactly the right setting for it. A room that was specifically constructed to make clear that whatever was about to be discussed would be discussed on terms that weren't entirely his. Vincent Harlow was 44, trim, with gray threading through dark hair at the temples in the particular way that reads as distinguished rather than aged in certain zip codes and industries. He wore a sport coat over a flannel shirt, which was Nashville's version of business casual, and he had the relaxed body language of someone accustomed to being the most powerful person in most rooms while projecting the aesthetic of not caring about that. He shook Danny's hand, nodded at Ellen with the respect of a man who had been on the receiving end of her legal work at some point, and sat down. I'll be direct, Vincent said. He produced a tablet and played a 2-minute excerpt of Forgiven Once from the Meridian sound session. This song stopped me in the middle of a drive home. I had to pull over. He set the tablet down. I've heard a lot of music in my life, and I've been pulled over by maybe 6 or 7 songs. This is one of them. Danny said nothing, which was a technique he'd learned from Ellen. When someone is saying something you want to hear, the worst thing you can do is fill the silence. There's a compilation project, Vincent continued. New voices in traditional country. Not a charity project. A real commercial release on a Nashville label I'm producing for. 8 tracks. I want Forgiven Once and Red Dirt Road Home on it. He paused. I'm also prepared to discuss a development deal for a full solo album on terms that are different from whatever you were working with previously. Ellen picked up her pencil. Define different. Performance exclusivity, limited to direct competitors only, not general public performance. Standard royalty structure, no recoupment clause on the first advance, and full artistic approval on production direction. He looked at Ellen rather than Danny while he said this, which told Danny something. I heard about the Pinnacle South situation. My terms are structured to not repeat that experience. Ellen made notes. The room was quiet, except for the sound of her pencil and the faint traffic on Music Row outside. What's your timeline on the compilation? Ellen asked. Recording complete by January. Release targeted for late spring. He finally turned to Danny. I know this is a lot to take in at once. I'm not asking for an answer today. But I want you to understand something. He leaned forward slightly. The reason this landed on my desk is because Alan Jackson made a phone call. I've been in this business 20 years, and I can count on one hand the times Alan Jackson has called me directly about someone. That carries weight. Danny thought about the folding chair in the production room. The way Alan had said, I watched her learn to walk without me holding on. The specific quality of being heard by someone who doesn't need to listen. I understand, Danny said. After Vincent left, Ellen sat back in her chair and looked at Danny with the measured expression of someone who had been waiting to say something. "The terms are legitimate," she said. "I'll need to review the actual contracts before I can advise you formally. But on the surface, he's offering you something that's structurally sound." A pause. "The question isn't whether this is a good deal. The question is whether you're ready for what comes after a good deal." What comes after? More decisions, more people, more versions of this conversation at higher stakes. She looked at him steadily. "The music part, you've always been ready for. The rest of it, that's what you're still figuring out." He knew she was right. He called Carol that evening. Not a text, a call. He sat in the truck outside the trailer in the dark, the phone on the seat beside him, and then picked it up and dialed before he could construct reasons not to. She answered on the third ring. "Danny." Not hostile, not warm, present. "I know it's late. I wanted to talk to you about something that isn't about the schedule." A brief pause. "Okay," he told her. Not everything. Not in a way that sounded like he was selling her on a new version of himself, which he knew from experience she could detect and close against immediately. Just the facts. The legal challenge, the recording sessions, the conversations with Alan Jackson and Ellen Marsh, and now Vincent Harlow. He told it the way you tell things when you've decided to stop managing how they land and just let them land. When he finished, Carol was quiet for a moment. "That's a lot," she said finally. "Yeah. Are you telling me because you think it changes something between us? Or are you telling me because you needed to tell someone?" It was a precise question, and it deserved a precise answer. He thought about it honestly. "Both," he said. "But mostly the second one." Another pause. Longer. "Okay," she said. And then, more quietly, "I'm glad something is working, Danny. I mean that. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. It was something smaller and, in its smallness, more real. The acknowledgement that two people who had hurt each other and been hurt could still, from a sufficient distance, wish each other something decent. "How's Lily?" he asked. "She drew a picture of a horse in school today and told her teacher it was you." Carol's voice shifted. Not warm exactly, but something adjacent to it. Mrs. Hale wasn't sure how to respond. Danny laughed. An actual laugh. The kind that comes out of you before you decide to have it. "I'll explain it to her sometime," he said. "Lily, I mean. The horse thing. Good luck with that." They said goodnight. He sat in the dark for a long time after, the trailer's single porch light throwing a yellow oval onto the gravel. And for the first time in what felt like years, the dark didn't feel like weight. It felt like the kind of quiet that precedes something. The Pinnacle South situation resolved itself in early December. Ellen had filed a formal challenge to the exclusivity clause in November, and after 2 weeks of back and forth through lawyers, Robert Finley, it turned out, did eventually answer calls when the person on the other end had Ellen Marsh's name attached. The company agreed to void the exclusivity provision in exchange for Danny releasing any further claims. Ellen recommended he take it. "You could push for more," she said. "But pushing for more takes time, and you have a compilation slot that expires in January. The practical value of your freedom right now is worth more than whatever additional damages we might extract from Pinnacle South 6 months from now." "What about Finley?" Ellen's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Robert Finley's track record is well documented in this community. He doesn't need me to add to it. You going forward in the way you're going forward is a far more effective response than anything legal we could do to him." Danny signed the release. That evening, he drove to his mother's house in Cookville, a 2-hour drive up I-40 that he made while listening to George Strait's pure country soundtrack on the truck's speakers. which was a choice he hadn't consciously planned, but which seemed, given everything, appropriate. His mother, Diane Calloway, was 63 and lived in the same house where Danny and Brett had grown up, on a street where the neighbors had mostly been there for 30 years, and everybody knew whose truck was whose. She met him at the door before he knocked. She'd heard the truck, and she hugged him the way mothers hug sons they've been worried about, with the full specific weight of everything that hadn't been said. "You look like yourself again," she said. "I'm working on it," he said. She made dinner. They sat at the kitchen table where 1,000 important and unimportant conversations had happened over the years, and Danny ate a real meal for the first time in what felt like months. The kind of food that exists only in the houses of people who know how you take your coffee, and remember that you've never liked onions in things they can be avoided in. He told her about George Strait. She went very still. "In a diner?" she said. "In a diner. And he just talked to you. Just talked to me." Diane was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your father used to say that the people who have actually gotten somewhere are the ones who remember what it felt like not to be there yet." She looked at Danny across the table. "I think he was right." Danny thought about a man in a gray jacket writing a name on a paper napkin, leaving $20 for a $3 coffee, and walking out into the rain without making anything of it. "Yeah," Danny said. "I think he was, too." January in Nashville arrived the way it always does, with a cold that feels personal, as though the city is specifically directing it at you, and a gray sky that sits so low over the honky-tonks and studios and parking lots of the music district that the whole place feels like it's being pressed down into itself. Danny spent the first 2 weeks of the month finishing the recording sessions at Meridian Sound. The 4 songs were done, truly done, not the endless, iterative, almost done of musicians who can't stop adjusting. And Cal Waverly had mixed them with the care of someone who understood that the space between the notes was as important as the notes themselves. The night they finished the final mix of Forgiven Once, Cal played it back through the full monitor system at a volume that made the production room feel like it was inside the song. And Danny sat in the folding chair with his eyes closed and listened to his own voice singing words he'd written in a Waffle House parking lot at 2 in the morning, and felt the particular strange experience of hearing yourself say, in music, something true that you couldn't have said in any other form. When it ended, the room was quiet. "That's it," Cal said. Not a question. "That's it," Danny agreed. The contract with Meridian Records and Vincent Harlow's production company went through Ellen Marsh's review over 2 weeks in January, during which she marked 15 items, negotiated 7 of them, and declared the final version acceptable with the specific lack of enthusiasm of someone whose standards are genuinely high. The signing happened on a Wednesday afternoon in Vincent Harlow's office, different from Ellen's, full of the gold records and industry photographs that she'd deliberately excluded from hers. And Danny signed 4 copies with a pen that Vincent offered, and Danny returned, a small detail that registered as an assertion of the version of himself he was trying to be. Present, but not swept away. That night, Danny went to pick up Lily for his Wednesday visit. Carol was waiting at the door when he pulled into the driveway of the Bellevue house. The house that had been their house until it wasn't. A 3-bedroom craftsman with a porch, where they'd sat on summer evenings when things were good, and where later they'd avoided sitting because the memory of when things were good was harder to be around than the current fact of things being bad. Lily came through the door at a dead run, the way 6-year-olds move when they're going somewhere they want to go, and hit Danny's legs at full speed. He caught her and lifted her and held her against his shoulder, and she smelled like school and apple juice and the specific warm child smell that he'd never found a word for and suspected didn't have one. "Daddy, I have a loose tooth," she told him. with the gravitas of someone reporting important news. Which one? She pointed, with a small finger, to one of her front teeth, which did appear to have some ambiguity about its future. That's a very important tooth, he said seriously. I know, she agreed. Mrs. Hale says, I'll get money. Mrs. Hale is correct. He looked up and found Carol watching from the doorway. Her expression was the careful neutral he knew well. But beneath it, in the set of her mouth, in the way she was looking at Lily rather than at him, something had shifted, very slightly, in a direction he couldn't name and didn't want to misinterpret. 7 o'clock, she said. 7 o'clock, he confirmed. He put Lily in the truck, in the car seat he'd bought 6 months ago, and kept in the back seat even on weeks when he didn't have her, because he'd discovered that having it there made him feel, in some intangible way, more like a father, and drove to his trailer, where he'd gotten a second-hand kids' table and set it up in the corner with a fresh coloring book and the animal crackers that Lily considered a culinary preference rather than a snack. They colored for an hour. Lily narrated the entire time. The names of the animals, the colors she was choosing and her reasoning, the politics of her first-grade classroom, a story about a girl named Josie who had done something at recess that was clearly regarded as a significant moral failing, but whose exact nature Danny couldn't entirely follow. He listened to every word. At one point, she looked up from her coloring book and said, with the directness that children deploy without knowing it's devastating, "Are you sad, Daddy?" He looked at her. Her eyes were Carol's, that particular shade of brown that shifted toward gold in certain light. "Not right now," he said. And it was true. She seemed to accept this and returned to her coloring with the efficiency of someone whose concerns had been addressed. The trouble came from a direction Danny should have anticipated but hadn't. It came from Brett. Not malicious trouble. Brett was not a malicious person. It was the trouble that comes from love, which is sometimes the most complicated kind because it doesn't announce itself as interference and doesn't feel like anything other than concern until the moment it tips over into something that has to be named. Brett had told their cousin Wayne about the record deal. Wayne Calloway was 38, lived in Murfreesboro, and had been playing in a moderately successful local band for 12 years. Good enough to have a following, not good enough to have broken through, in that specific Nashville category of musician who has been on the edge of something for long enough that the edge starts to feel like the destination. Wayne called Danny on a Friday evening. "I heard about the Meridian deal," Wayne said. "Brett told me." "Yeah." Danny waited. "I was wondering if there was room on the compilation for another track." The words were casual, but the weight behind them wasn't. "I've got a song that Ellen Marsh actually heard 2 years ago. She said it was good. I just never had the right placement." Danny knew what he was being asked. He also knew that the compilation wasn't his to offer. It was Vincent Harlow's project, and the track list was effectively settled. And recommending his cousin wasn't something Danny had the standing or the relationship to do at this stage. 3 weeks into a brand new professional situation. He told Wayne this, as gently as he could. Wayne was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm not asking you to do anything wrong. I'm asking you to mention my name. Wayne, you know how long I've been working at this? 12 years. I've watched you come up and struggle, and now you've got George Strait and Alan Jackson and a production deal, and I'm not asking for anything you haven't been given. I'm asking for a mention." The conversation ended badly. Not with shouting, but with the worse kind of ending. The one where both people hang up still believing they're right. And the silence between them afterward is a different kind of silence than before. Danny called Brett. "You shouldn't have told Wayne," he said. Brett was quiet for a moment. "I know. I was proud of you, and I said more than I should have." A pause. He's been struggling, Danny. I don't know what I thought. I know what you thought. But now he's angry at me for not doing something I can't do, and that's—" Danny stopped. "I understand why you told him. I do. But it puts me in a position that isn't fair." "I know." Brett's voice was heavy with it. "I'll talk to him." "Don't. Let it settle." Danny leaned against the trailer wall. "This is the stuff nobody tells you about, right? That every good thing that happens to you reshuffles the relationships around it." Brett was quiet for a long moment. "Is it worth it?" Danny thought about Lily saying, "Are you sad?" Daddy with crayon in her hand. About the final mix of "Forgiven Once" filling a room. About a man in a gray jacket asking what comes out and actually wanting to know. "Yeah," he said, "but that doesn't make the reshuffling not hurt." The hardest week came in the third week of January. Danny had 2 back-to-back 10-hour delivery days because 2 colleagues were out sick, and he'd taken the extra hours because the medical bills from a dental issue in November were still showing up in his mailbox with the persistent optimism of invoices that don't know you've stopped opening them. On the second day, he came home at 7:30 to find that a water pipe under the trailer's bathroom sink had developed a leak that had been running into the cabinet for what appeared to be several days. The cabinet was ruined, the flooring beneath it was soft and damaged, and the repair estimate from the emergency plumber, a tired man named Dennis, who came with the weary efficiency of someone who spent his days inside other people's worst moments, was $800 minimum. Danny sat on the edge of the trailer's small bed after Dennis left, still in his work clothes, and stared at the wall. The record deal was real. The songs were recorded. Alan Jackson had made a phone call. George Strait had given him a napkin with a name on it. And he was sitting in a trailer with a ruined bathroom and $800 he didn't have. And his daughter was across town asking questions about loose teeth. And his cousin was angry at him. And his ex-wife thought of him primarily as a logistics problem. And tomorrow he had to be at the freight forward depot by 6 a.m. He called the only person who made sense to call. "Brett," he said when his brother answered, "I need to borrow some money." In the Calloway family, asking Brett for money was not a small thing. It had happened before, early in Danny's Nashville years, when the romantic version of chasing a dream was still intact, and the practical implications of it were still abstract. And it had left a residue on both of them that neither had entirely acknowledged. Brett listened to the pipe situation without interrupting. "800, he said. "I'll pay you back in March. I have the advance clearing then." "I know you will." A brief silence. "Danny." "Yeah. You know what Dad used to say about asking for help? That it was a form of trust," Danny said. He knew the speech. He'd heard it at various points in his life when he'd resisted asking for what he needed, because asking meant admitting he needed it. That refusing to ask was a way of keeping people at arm's length. "Yeah," Brett said. He was right about that one. The money arrived via transfer 15 minutes later. Danny sat with his phone in his hand and thought about how the hardest things were rarely the dramatic things. Not the career challenges, or the legal battles, or the moments of creative pressure. The hardest things were the ones that required you to let yourself be helped, to admit the gap between where you were and where you were trying to go, and trust that the people who loved you could hold some of the weight, without it meaning you'd failed. He called his mother. "Are you okay?" she asked, the way she'd always asked, before hello, before anything else. The question that had been her first form of love for him since he was old enough to leave the house. "I'm getting there," he said. "I just needed to hear your voice." The situation with Vincent Harlow deteriorated, briefly and significantly, in the last week of January. The trigger was a phone call Danny received from a journalist at a Nashville music publication. A sharp, careful woman named Donna Reese, who covered the industry with a particular interest in the intersection of independent artists and major production companies. She was writing a piece about Meridian Records and mentioned, in passing, that she'd heard Vincent Harlow was planning to market the compilation with significant emphasis on the behind-the-scenes story of its discovery. Specifically, the Alan Jackson connection, which had apparently leaked somewhere in the small, porous world of Nashville's music business. "Does it bother you?" Donna asked. "The framing of the story being about the connections rather than the music?" Danny said he'd get back to her. He called Ellen. "The narrative question is real," Ellen said. "Harlow knows that a story about Alan Jackson calling Vincent Harlow about an unknown artist is a better press hook than a story about the music itself. He's a producer. Narrative is part of how he thinks about everything." A pause. "The question is whether that narrative serves your interests or uses them. How do I find out?" "You ask him directly." The meeting with Vincent Harlow was not comfortable. Danny sat across the desk from him and said, plainly, that he'd spoken to Donna Reese and had concerns about how the marketing framing of the project would position him. Vincent Harlow was quiet for a moment. The considering kind, not the deflecting kind. "You're right that the connection story is a press hook," he said finally. "I won't pretend otherwise. But the hook gets people to listen. And what they hear when they listen is your music. That's the sequence." He leaned forward. "You know what gets released and forgotten in this industry? Everything that doesn't have a story attached to it. The story isn't the point. The story is the door." Danny thought about a diner on Franklin Road. A name on a paper napkin. "The story is the door," he repeated. "Yeah. Okay." Danny looked at him steadily. "But the story gets told accurately. George Strait didn't discover me. He had a conversation with me and gave me a name. That's what happened, and that's what gets said." Vincent looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded. A single, clean nod. "That's what gets said," he agreed. The compilation, titled American Voices, New Traditions in Country, was released on a Thursday in late April, 8 months after Danny had played his set to 9 people at the Rusty Spur, one of whom had been asleep. The release was not immediate news. It was not a chart event on day one, not the subject of significant mainstream attention in its first week. What it was, in the specific and particular way that things spread in music before they become undeniable, was a conversation. The conversation started, as it often does, with a handful of people who heard something in it that they felt compelled to send to someone else. Forgiven Once appeared on a Spotify playlist called Songs That Hit Different at Night that had 200,000 followers, and from there, it began the gradual aggregating movement of a song finding its audience the way water finds its level. Slowly, then all at once. By the end of the first week, the song had 180,000 streams. By the end of the second, it had crossed 1 million. Danny found out about the streaming numbers at a freight forward depot on a Tuesday morning, standing beside his truck in the cold parking lot, his phone showing a notification from a music analytics app that Ellen Marsh had told him to download. He looked at the number for a long moment. Then he clocked in and ran his route. He told Cal Waverly that evening, and Cal, a man who had seen enough of the IB industry to have calibrated reactions, smiled the slow smile of someone who had been waiting for this particular number to arrive. Red Dirt Road Home followed 2 weeks later, picking up traction on a different playlist. A morning drive country mix curated by a radio programmer in Texas who had grown up on the real stuff and was tired of apologizing for it. The song hit Nashville's country radio radar by the 3rd week of May, and 2 stations, one in Tennessee, one in Georgia, added it to rotation. Danny heard it on the radio for the first time while driving his delivery route on a Wednesday morning. He was on Murfreesboro Pike, a package of restaurant equipment in the back. The morning gray and cold the way Nashville mornings still were in May, before the heat arrived in earnest. He was scanning stations out of habit when his own voice came through the truck's speakers. And he was so unprepared for it that he actually pulled over on the shoulder of Murfreesboro Pike, in the delivery truck, hazard lights blinking, and just sat there and listened to the whole thing. When it ended, the DJ said, "That's Danny Calloway, Red Dirt Road Home, off the American Voices compilation. New voice, old soul. That's the real thing right there, folks." Danny sat in the truck for a long time. He didn't cry, which he'd been afraid he might. What he felt was something quieter and more structural than tears. The specific sensation of a thing that has been out of alignment for a long time settling. With a sound, you feel more than hear. Back into place. He called Brett. Brett picked up on the first ring, which meant he'd been watching the numbers too. "I just heard it on the radio," Danny said. Brett made the sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite something else. The specific vocalization of a person experiencing an emotion they don't have a word for. "How does it feel?" Danny looked out the windshield at the Murfreesboro Pike morning, at the ordinary landscape of a city going about its business, at the identical beauty of a Tuesday that was completely unlike every other Tuesday. "Like something I'm not going to let myself forget," he said. Vincent Harlow called 2 days after the radio ads with the news that Meridian Records wanted to begin preliminary conversations about the solo album. The terms would build on the compilation contract. Ellen Marsh had already requested the preliminary term sheet. And the timeline was ambitious. Recording to begin in the fall, with a targeted release the following spring. Danny said he'd have Ellen call. He was learning that the having Ellen call, the pausing before yes, the slowing down in exactly the moments where everything in him wanted to move fast, was not caution for its own sake. It was the discipline of someone who had learned, at real cost, the difference between a door opening and a door designed to look like one. In May, on a warm Saturday afternoon when the Nashville air finally had the quality of the season you'd been waiting for, Danny drove to the elementary school where Lily's class was having a spring fair. Carol had texted him the details 3 days earlier. Saturday, 10 to 2, Brookwood Elementary, parking on the east side. And it was the most information she'd ever sent him voluntarily about an event, which he understood to mean something without wanting to overread it. He arrived at 10:15 with a bag of the individual cracker packs and apple juice boxes that were Lily's preferred provisions for any outdoor event, and found the school's front lawn transformed into the chaotic, joyful organization of a children's fair. Game booths, a bounce house, a table covered in objects that first graders had painted in the specific way that prioritizes enthusiasm over representation. Lily found him before he found her. She came running across the grass at the speed she always moved at, wearing a pink shirt and her hair in 2 uneven braids that Carol had clearly attempted, and Lily had partially undone during the drive. And she hit his legs with the full force of 35 pounds of forward momentum and grabbed his hand and immediately began pulling him toward something important. "Daddy, come see what I made," she commanded, in the tone of someone for whom the social protocol of greetings has always been an obstacle to the actual business of life. He went where she pulled him. Carol was standing near the painted objects table, talking to another parent. She saw Danny over the other parent's shoulder and lifted one hand. A small wave, not elaborate, not performed. The kind of gesture that passes between people who have arrived, through difficulty and time and the gradual accumulation of smaller dignities, at something resembling peace. Danny lifted his hand back. Lily showed him a ceramic bowl she had painted in approximately 7 colors, none of which appeared on the color wheel in the combination she'd chosen. With a sun on one side and something that was either a horse or a dog on the other. "It's for you," she said, with the certainty of someone who has made a decision and doesn't require external validation. He turned it over in his hands. The bowl was slightly lopsided, the way handmade things are when made by hands still learning their craft, and the paint was thick in some places and thin in others, and the sun had rays that went in directions. Suns don't technically go, and it was the most purely beautiful object he'd seen in years. "I'm going to keep this forever," he said. She accepted this as her due and moved on to the next important thing. The story, when it finally ran in Donna Reese's piece for the Nashville music publication in early June, was told the way Danny had asked it to be told. Accurately. The headline was, "A Conversation in a Diner, a Name on a Napkin, and 4 Songs That Changed Everything." It described George Strait not as a discoverer or a kingmaker, but as a person who had, without fanfare or agenda, listened to someone who needed to be listened to and offered what he had to offer. A name, a number, and the specific generosity of being taken seriously. It described Alan Jackson's role the same way, not as a rescue, but as a witness, as someone who heard something real and said so, and then did what people with reach and nothing to prove sometimes do, made a phone call. It described Danny as a musician from Cookeville, Tennessee, who had spent 9 years in Nashville learning the difference between a city that pretends to value the real thing and the actual real thing itself, and who had found, in the worst year of his professional life, that the second category still existed. The piece was widely shared. In Nashville, where every musician had a version of this story, and most of them ended differently, it hit something particular. Not because it was a fairy tale, it wasn't, but because it was specific and true, and because it named the thing that the music industry regularly obscures, that the path through it, when it exists, tends to run through other human beings who have not forgotten what it feels like to need a path. Danny read the piece on his phone on a Tuesday morning, sitting in the same diner on Franklin Road where he'd sat across from a man in a gray jacket 8 months earlier. May's Road Kitchen. The same ceiling fan, the same wall of framed photographs. He ordered coffee and the biscuits and gravy without looking at the menu. The waitress, not the same one from that October morning, refilled his coffee without being asked, the way they do in diners that have their rhythm down, and Danny sat with the piece open on his phone and then set the phone face down on the table and looked out the window at the Franklin Road morning. He thought about his father's hands, about the specific sound of Brett's real laugh, about his mother saying "you look like yourself again," about Lily pulling him across a school lawn toward something important with the confidence of someone who had no doubt he'd follow, about a man who could have been anywhere on a Tuesday morning and chose a diner on Franklin Road and sat across from a stranger and asked what comes out and actually wanted to know. He'd never properly thanked him. He wasn't sure he ever would, not for lack of trying, but because some things exist in a register that regular gratitude can't reach. What George Strait had done was not the kind of thing that responds well to formal acknowledgement. It was the kind of thing that responds to being paid forward, to sitting across from the next person who looks the way Danny had looked that morning, and asking the right question, and actually listening to the answer. He was going to try to be that person. The recording sessions for the solo album began in September at Meridian Sound, in the same Victorian house in East Nashville where it had all started. Cal Waverly had the coffee made when Danny arrived at 5:47 on the first Tuesday morning. 6 minutes early. Always 6 minutes early. One of the last habits he'd kept from the version of himself he used to respect. And the room smelled like coffee, and the particular productive silence of a space waiting for sound. Danny had 9 new songs. He'd written 6 of them in the past year, in the freight forward truck and the trailer and the two-bedroom apartment in Inglewood he'd moved into in August. A real apartment, with a bedroom for Lily on the weekends, with a coloring table in the corner, and the ceramic bowl on a shelf in the living room where he could see it from the kitchen. The other three he'd written before Nashville, in the years in Cookeville when the dream was still entirely theoretical, and the music was purely his, the kind of songs that had no audience except the person writing them, which is sometimes where the best ones come from. He'd been saving those three for something that felt worthy of them. Cal settled behind the mixing board and looked at him with the steady readiness of a man who understood that what happened in this room over the next several months mattered. "Where do you want to start?" Cal asked. Danny thought about it. "The oldest one," he said. "Let's start with the oldest one." He settled on the stool. He adjusted the microphone. Outside, the East Nashville morning was going about its business. The coffee shops opening, the streets filling with the ordinary momentum of a city in motion. All of it carrying on in the beautiful, indifferent way that cities carry on while the things that matter are happening quietly inside buildings that don't announce themselves. He put his fingers on the strings. He played. The delivery truck sat idle at the freight forward depot for the last time on a Friday afternoon in October, when Danny Calloway turned in his keys to the shift supervisor, a steady, decent man named Harold Pierce, who had known about the music all along and had quietly adjusted Danny's route more times than Danny had realized to accommodate the recording sessions. "We'll miss you," Harold said, shaking his hand. "I'll miss the route," Danny said, and meant it. Outside in the parking lot, Brett was waiting in his truck, having driven up from Cookeville for no particular reason except that he wanted to be there, which was the best possible reason. They drove to a barbecue place on Nolensville Pike, the same one, the one they always went to, and ate at a picnic table outside in the October air while the afternoon light moved through the trees along the road in the long, golden, specific way of Tennessee autumns. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. In a diner on Franklin Road, a paper napkin with a name on it was long gone, but what it had set in motion remained. Not as a story about connections or industry or the machinery of success, but as evidence of something simpler and harder to explain, that the right conversation, at the right moment, with someone who actually listens, can change the entire direction of a life. Nobody saw it happen. That was the whole point.